The knock on the door was soft, almost polite, but it carried the weight of inevitability. A widow opened it, hands trembling, clutching the last coins she had managed to save. Across from her stood a man whose manners were impeccable, whose smile radiated reassurance. He promised help, a way to keep her home, a way to feed her children. She believed him. And in that single handshake, everything began to unravel. Contracts were laid before her, words of comfort whispered, clauses hidden in fine print, payments that seemed manageable multiplied into insurmountable burdens, late fees, compounded interest, penalties, each calculated to ensnare without immediate detection. The law, which should have offered protection, became a tool of manipulation. Appeals dragged for months, court notices arrived too late or too early, and influence ensured that every step she took toward justice ended in exhaustion and frustration. Families watched helplessly as their lives slipped beyond reach, and the architect of their ruin walked freely, admired in society, untouchable in reputation. Another family, immigrants seeking stability, followed the same path. They approached him, hoping for a small loan to secure a modest apartment. The contract seemed fair, temporary, a way to start a life in the city of opportunity. Within weeks, the loan's true cost revealed itself. Hidden clauses, multiplied payments, fees surged, and notices arrived with precision designed to confuse and intimidate. When they sought legal recourse, delays, lost paperwork, and technicalities blocked their path. Their home was eventually auctioned, and every attempt to fight back deepened their entanglement. The cruelty was deliberate. Small gestures of kindness, advice, smiles, and attention all served a single purpose: dependency. Families who believed they were receiving help were actually being guided, step by step, into ruin. The illusion of support masked the tightening of a trap. No one noticed until too late that each decision, each signed paper, each casual reassurance was part of a strategy to control and destroy. Public appearances amplified the torment. The man whose manipulations ruined lives attended galas, funded schools, and smiled in photographs, presenting himself as a pillar of society. To the world, he was respected and untouchable. To the victims, each public commendation became a layer of humiliation. The contrast between his image and the lives he shattered intensified the suffering, making private loss feel invisible and inescapable. Attempts to resist met relentless obstruction. Letters, petitions, and appeals vanished in bureaucracy, delayed, or were dismissed with exacting precision. Patience was the weapon. Patience and calculation. One family could be broken in months. Another struggled for years before surrendering to the inevitability of his influence. Each success reinforced his untouchability. Each silenced voice deepened the despair of those left behind. Even survival carried scars. Families that avoided total ruin endured years of stress, relocation, and the subtle social stigma of having once been in trouble. Communities became cautious, advising wariness and restraint. Trust became dangerous. Hope became fragile. The ripple effect extended beyond the immediate victims, reshaping neighborhoods, teaching in whispers that help could be a trap. The psychological cruelty rivaled the financial. Families depended on guidance that led them to disaster. Every suggestion, every small nudge, was designed to create dependence and then dismantle it. Missteps were inevitable, yet each was orchestrated to appear accidental. Despair became constant, and resilience faltered under the relentless pressure of invisible manipulation. Children learned fear and caution before hope, understanding that the man who offered aid could just as easily take everything. A widow seeking a short-term loan to pay overdue rent and medical bills found herself ensnared in this pattern. She believed the terms were fair, secured by property she had inherited. Hidden clauses doubled obligations. Late notices arrived to appear justified, and the property eventually went to auction, purchased indirectly to ensure control. She lost home security and trust. Her children internalized the lesson that a single man's cunning could destroy what generations had built. The pattern repeated relentlessly. Families who believed they had escaped his reach discovered, too late, that every interaction carried hidden consequences. A small business owner, barely scraping by, approached him for advice on a property dispute. He offered guidance, reassured them, and promised resolution. Months later, the property was seized, court notices mounted, and the owner found himself unable to operate without fear of bankruptcy. Customers left, suppliers demanded cash in advance, and the neighborhood whispered cautionary tales. All the while, the man continued his social appearances, smiling, congratulated for his wisdom and generosity, as if the ruined families were ghosts, their suffering irrelevant. Children grew up in fear without understanding the source. They learned early that stability could vanish overnight, that trust could be weaponized, that the man who appeared to help could be the same one who dismantled their lives. They watched as parents' faces hardened, once gentle smiles replaced by exhaustion and despair. Every argument about money, every legal notice, every conversation about survival carried the invisible fingerprints of his design. His cruelty was silent but unmistakable, and the lessons it taught were long-lasting. Neighborhoods themselves began to change. Families who survived the initial blows became cautious, suspicious of outsiders, hesitant to seek help. Small businesses altered contracts. Communities whispered warnings in hushed tones. A ripple effect of fear spread as silently as the smoke from the factories. Trust was no longer an automatic assumption. Every offer of assistance was met with caution. Every handshake weighed against potential betrayal. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims, touching entire blocks and communities with the invisible hand of his influence. Even when families tried to band together, they found that the man's methods were designed to isolate and divide. Legal threats, subtle manipulations, and the careful orchestration of events ensured that collaboration rarely succeeded. Neighbors who attempted to support one another found themselves dragged into disputes, paperwork complications, or unintended financial entanglements. Each victory for him was a lesson in helplessness, a reminder that resistance required resources, knowledge, and connections most people did not possess. The scope of his destruction became almost impossible to measure. Dozens of families, each story unique, yet all following the same arc: trust, manipulation, subtle dependence, and collapse. Some lost homes, others lost savings or businesses. Some endured public humiliation, others suffered quietly, their dignity stripped by unseen contracts and invisible calculations. The architect of their ruin maintained perfect public composure, a social figure whose reputation insulated him from scrutiny, criticism, or suspicion. The dissonance between the public image and private devastation was deliberate, sharpening the cruelty with each appearance. Each handshake, each photograph, even survivors were marked. Families that escaped total destruction still bore permanent scars, financial insecurity, altered social standing, lingering anxiety. Children internalized fear, learning to anticipate betrayal before it could arrive. Parents became cautious, calculating, hesitant to make decisions without evaluating potential hidden consequences. Communities learned collectively that aid often came disguised as peril, and every offer was measured against the probability of disaster. The social landscape itself was reshaped by the unseen manipulations, leaving a legacy of suspicion, caution, and mistrust. The psychological aspect of his cruelty was perhaps the most enduring. He understood that destroying hope and trust could be more damaging than financial loss. Families who tried to rebuild found themselves haunted by the memory of the contracts, the notices, the subtle ways their independence had been stripped. Every letter, every document, every reassurance he offered became a symbol of vulnerability and loss. Emotional manipulation compounded the material, leaving victims unsure of their own judgment, hesitant to act, and perpetually anxious about what might come next. One widow, struggling to manage rent and medical expenses, discovered too late that the very guidance she relied upon had been calculated to ruin her. Small reassurances disguised as advice guided every decision, each step designed to deepen entanglement. Eventually, her property was auctioned. Savings vanished, trust shattered. Her children learned a lesson that would shadow them for life. A single person's cunning could erase everything a family had built over generations. Across the city, similar stories unfolded. Immigrant families lost apartments, businesses closed under subtle legal maneuvers, and entire streets felt the shadow of caution. Even those untouched directly observed the outcomes, adjusting their behavior in anticipation of potential peril. The man's influence extended beyond the individuals he ruined, shaping neighborhoods, altering relationships, and embedding a culture of wariness and suspicion. Trust, once assumed, became dangerous. Hope, once a natural instinct, became a measured, fragile commodity. And yet, throughout all the destruction, he remained untouchable. Social accolades, charitable events, and photographs of him smiling, for civic boards concealed the devastation. Wrought in private, he walked freely among the city's elite, while his victims struggled to survive, forced to navigate a system manipulated to favor him. Each ruined family, each collapsed household, served only to reinforce his public image, a brilliant duality that made his cruelty invisible to the outside world. By the time a neighborhood fully recognized the pattern, the cumulative effect was staggering. Families learned too late that small signs, friendly gestures, minor loans, casual advice were traps. Attempts at resistance were met with bureaucracy, delay, or subtle sabotage. The man's patience ensured that no act of defiance succeeded. Without extraordinary effort, while the inevitability of collapse loomed over every decision, fear became instinct, hope conditional, trust a risk weighed carefully against potential loss. The relentless precision of his cruelty left the city marked. Children grew up cautious, adults became calculating, communities whispered warnings in private. Each new family entering his orbit became part of the same unbroken cycle of manipulation, and the longer his pattern went unchallenged, the more entrenched it became. The weight of his influence, invisible yet undeniable, left a legacy that would linger for generations, a quiet, pervasive shadow over the lives of everyone he touched. The day they realized how completely their lives had been commandeered was the day hope quietly died in their homes. A family that once believed a small loan would keep them afloat now stared at foreclosure notices, each more severe than the last. Children asked questions parents couldn't answer. Every conversation about money, every glance at a legal document, was a reminder that one man's orchestration had left them powerless. There was no dramatic confrontation, no thunderous declaration, just the slow, inevitable unraveling of lives. Neighbors whispered, but no one intervened. Those who had survived prior encounters with him were careful, fearful of appearing involved. The sense of isolation was crushing. Families realized that help came with strings, so tight that pulling back or resisting felt impossible. Even when they tried to negotiate, every attempt was anticipated, countered, or delayed, leaving them to navigate a system where each move was manipulated against them. Survival required constant vigilance, yet no action could restore what had been lost. One small business owner had hoped to recover from a minor financial setback by seeking advice. He was meticulous, cautious, and calculated in his choices, yet every step led to another trap. Guidance disguised as mentorship slowly chipped away at stability. Inventory vanished in legal claims, debts multiplied, and reputation eroded as rumors spread in the local market. Each setback appeared coincidental, but it was not. Every detail was part of a plan to control, isolate, and ultimately dismantle livelihoods. The psychological weight was immense. Families became conditioned to fear assistance, to doubt every offer of help, to question every contract or letter. Trust, once a natural instinct, became a liability. Children observed parents second-guessing every decision and learned the silent lesson that the world could be both generous and ruinous at the same time. Every handshake, every smile from someone who appeared kind, carried the potential for destruction. Even for those who escaped complete financial ruin, life was forever altered. Relocation, lost savings, broken relationships, and ongoing anxiety marked their days. Community interactions became measured, carefully calculated, and laden with suspicion. Children carried the memory of instability into adulthood. Parents approached every opportunity with wariness, assessing risks invisible to outsiders. The pattern of influence extended beyond the immediate victims, touching entire blocks, shaping behavior, and instilling a collective caution that would outlive the initial losses. The cruelty had a rhythm, almost imperceptible to those outside its grip. Small favors extended, contracts drafted, Guidance offered, all carefully timed to create dependency. Once a family's trust was earned, the unraveling began. Bills arrived slightly late, penalties accrued unnoticed, documents buried in paperwork. What seemed accidental was deliberate. A wrong signature here, a misread clause there, a delayed notice. Every element orchestrated to maintain control and ensure the victim's inability to act in time. Widows, immigrants, and laborers alike discovered that their attempts to resist were anticipated. Every petition filed in court was countered by technicalities. Every appeal for leniency met delays and obstruction. Even when they thought they had outsmarted the system, subtle manipulations emerged to reinforce the cycle. Patience was his ally. The longer the entanglement persisted, the more devastating the outcome. Families learned that resistance was not futile, but painfully costly, leaving them exhausted and cautious. The erosion of trust extended beyond financial matters. Relationships frayed as tension and blame settled into households. Spouses argued over decisions guided by unseen hands. Children questioned the stability of their parents' choices. Even neighbors, once willing to help, hesitated, understanding that involvement could carry unforeseen consequences. Communities absorbed the shock collectively, whispering warnings to new families, embedding cautionary tales into the fabric of daily life. A widow who had attempted to navigate a small emergency loan watched, helplessly, as her property was quietly transferred to intermediaries. Savings vanished, letters arrived with vague but threatening language, and her children absorbed lessons in vulnerability that would stay with them for life. Every step, each seemingly minor decision, had been guided by someone, calculating outcomes far beyond what the family could anticipate. The destruction was silent but absolute. Across neighborhoods, the impact became evident. Streets where families had once welcomed each other with trust now saw caution in every gesture. Shopkeepers hesitated to offer credit. Mothers questioned every invitation. Fathers evaluated every opportunity. The invisible network of manipulation had extended into the social fabric, shaping decisions and behaviors far beyond those directly targeted. Observers learned quickly that engagement could bring ruin, and the lessons were passed down quietly, reinforcing fear and caution. Even those who attempted to rebuild were haunted by past experiences. The slightest misstep in contracts, loans, or negotiations could trigger old anxieties, causing hesitation that limited opportunity. Children grown into adolescence carried fear and distrust as inheritance. Adults, conditioned by repeated encounters with manipulation, approached life cautiously, every step measured against potential consequences they could not fully control. And yet the man at the center of it all remained untouched by consequence. Public appearances continued, smiles extended at charity events, recognition granted by civic leaders. The same individual responsible for hundreds of ruined lives walked among society, untouchable, admired, a stark contrast to the suffering he orchestrated. Each social accolade deepened the humiliation of victims, reinforcing the duality of his existence. Visible respect paired with invisible destruction. The escalation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A family that had survived initial financial setbacks found themselves entangled in new contracts, each seemingly minor, each strategically designed. One signature, a casual agreement, led to another layer of obligations. Letters arrived with legal language that intimidated and confused. Bills doubled unexpectedly. Penalties accumulated silently. And in every instance, resistance was anticipated and neutralized. Each move taken by the victims only tightened the invisible grip. Parents tried to shield their children, but the lessons of fear were unavoidable. Every denied opportunity, every lost home, every unexpected eviction became a story passed down through whispered warnings. Children learned the hard truth that the world could not be trusted, that even kindness could be a trap, and that survival required vigilance at every moment. Playgrounds, schools, and streets carried the silent weight of their parents' failures and manipulations. The community's fabric was strained, stitched together with caution and suspicion rather than ease and trust. Small business owners were not spared. One shopkeeper who sought help to expand operations received advice that seemed straightforward. Within months, debts had accumulated through obscure clauses and subtle pressures. Suppliers demanded prepayment, and customers were lost due to legal entanglements orchestrated indirectly. Bankruptcy loomed, not through chance but through deliberate orchestration. Every setback appeared coincidental, yet it was meticulously planned to consolidate control. The ripple effect reached even those who had never directly encountered him. Families adjusted behaviors, neighbors advised against interactions, community leaders quietly reshaped policies to avoid similar pitfalls. Trust became conditional. Every handshake and contract was scrutinized with suspicion. Hope was measured in terms of risk, and generosity was weighed against the probability of deception. The city's social dynamics shifted quietly, almost invisibly, yet the shadow of one man's influence touched nearly every corner. Attempts to fight back were met with the same precision that had orchestrated the initial manipulations. Court filings delayed, legal challenges sidestepped, petitions dismissed. Victims quickly realized that traditional avenues of resistance were ineffective. Even well-intentioned interventions often triggered new complications, as each family became entangled in a web that had been woven long before they entered it. Frustration and despair compounded, leaving families hesitant to act, hesitant to trust, and increasingly aware of their vulnerability. Isolation was a recurring consequence. Families could not rely on neighbors or friends without risking further entanglement. One family attempted collective action, seeking advice and pooling resources to fight back. Legal pressures and subtle manipulations ensured that their efforts failed, creating tension between neighbors and eroding community cohesion. The very attempt to resist became another layer of stress, reinforcing the notion that survival required solitude, suspicion, and constant vigilance. Even survivors bore the invisible scars of manipulation. A family who managed to retain their home still lived in fear, checking every document, scrutinizing every agreement, and avoiding contact with anyone who might bring additional complications. Children learned to measure trust in fractions, weighing every interaction with adults carefully. Parents navigated daily life with caution, hesitant to take opportunities that could lead to hidden pitfalls. Each day became a balancing act, a constant assessment of risk against necessity, leaving no space for ease or certainty. The psychological impact was amplified by the duality of his existence. Publicly respected, he continued to attend events, smile at charity functions, and receive accolades for civic contribution. Privately, he had orchestrated the collapse of dozens of households. The stark contrast deepened the cruelty. Victims' suffering was invisible to the outside world, their humiliation compounded by society's praise of the very man responsible. Every smile, every handshake, every public acknowledgement served as a reminder that justice was out of reach, and that the damage inflicted was unlikely to be recognized or reversed. Families who attempted to rebuild after initial setbacks discovered that the manipulations were persistent, almost self-perpetuating. Minor missteps, overlooked clauses, or simple misunderstandings were magnified into new crises. Legal entanglements resurfaced, debts reappeared, and opportunities vanished. The sense of inevitability was crushing. Even those who thought they had learned, the rules soon found that the rules themselves were designed to favor him, leaving no true escape. The man's patience amplified the suffering. He allowed months, even years, to pass while families struggled, adjusting his manipulations to maintain maximum control. Timing was everything. Notices arrived just late enough to create confusion, deadlines were set to increase stress, and minor victories for the families were neutralized by subsequent obligations. The slow, relentless nature of the manipulation ensured that victims were never able to regain confidence, never able to anticipate what might come next, and always aware that the hand guiding them was one of control, not assistance. By the time a neighborhood fully recognized the patterns, the damage was extensive. Families had been financially drained, psychologically scarred, and socially isolated. Communities had learned to avoid engagement, to distrust offers of help, and to weigh every interaction for hidden consequences. The invisible web stretched across blocks, affecting lives far beyond those directly targeted. The long-term impact was profound. Trust eroded, fear became instinctive, and the lessons of manipulation were passed quietly from parent to child, ensuring that his influence extended for generations. Even those untouched directly felt the shadow. Business owners, parents, and neighbors acted cautiously, adjusting decisions to avoid potential entanglement. Opportunities were declined, risks minimized, and interactions measured. The presence of a single, calculating predator reshaped entire social dynamics, instilling a culture of suspicion that would linger long after the initial manipulations had occurred. The letters began arriving in the early morning. Though the timing was designed to unsettle rather than inform, a family, already strained from mounting debt, discovered notices for payments they had never anticipated. The language was precise, legal, and intimidating. Each sentence carried the weight of authority, yet the reality was that no immediate consequence had been applied. The uncertainty itself was the punishment. Parents spent hours deciphering the terms, children watched anxiously, and every day became an exercise in stress management. What seemed like a minor oversight at first gradually revealed itself as a thread in a web too complex to escape. Attempts to negotiate were fruitless. When they contacted intermediaries, they were redirected, given incomplete answers, or delayed until deadlines loomed. Small victories, temporary pauses, or partial approvals were carefully timed to give the illusion of control, only to collapse under new pressures. Every action taken by the victims was anticipated, neutralized, or redirected. The slow, deliberate nature of these manipulations left families exhausted, their energy spent on survival rather than growth or rebuilding. Even social gatherings became a source of tension. Parents hesitated to invite neighbors, fearing that a shared tip or casual advice might carry hidden consequences. Children sensed the unease, asking questions that could not be answered, internalizing the message that the world was unreliable. Trust, once assumed between community members, was replaced by caution. Conversations were measured, actions were calculated, and every interaction carried a silent assessment of risk. The invisible reach of one man had transformed entire neighborhoods into a landscape of fear and suspicion. For small business owners, the consequences were equally devastating. One proprietor who sought guidance to resolve a supplier dispute found that advice led to new entanglements. Payments doubled, contracts were reinterpreted to his disadvantage, and legal claims arose out of nowhere. Each setback appeared coincidental, yet it was carefully orchestrated. Customers and suppliers alike adjusted their behavior in response, leaving the business isolated, financially strained, and ultimately unsustainable. By the time the proprietor realized the pattern, it was too late. Every path forward was obstructed, every solution manipulated to favor the predator at the center of it all. The psychological toll was relentless. Families who had endured initial losses became hyper-aware, anticipating danger in every decision. Parents measured every move. Children mirrored the caution, and even the smallest interaction became a potential trap. The city itself felt the weight. As whispers of caution spread, neighborhoods became insular, and strangers were met with suspicion. Generosity became calculated, assistance scrutinized, and even ordinary transactions were evaluated for hidden risk. The ripple effect of manipulation had extended far beyond the immediate victims, reshaping social norms and community behavior. A widow who had once trusted the man to secure a short-term loan for rent now found herself entangled in additional obligations. Letters arrived with subtle threats, deadlines were set to maximize stress, and her property was slowly transferred through intermediaries under his control. Every attempt to reclaim stability met obstacles, each orchestrated to maintain dominance. Children internalized these experiences, learning fear and caution long before lessons of hope or opportunity. Each day reinforced the lesson that survival required vigilance, patience, and constant calculation. Even those who tried to assist often fell victim to the subtle mechanisms in place. Neighbors who offered advice, legal aid, or moral support found themselves drawn into disputes, caught between obligations and delayed consequences. Families isolated themselves, unwilling to risk entanglement for fear that intervention would only worsen the outcome. Every act of kindness was measured against potential cost, and communities adapted quickly to the invisible threat that permeated daily life. Attempts at financial recovery were consistently undermined. Small gains were offset by sudden fees, unexpected notices, or legal claims that seemed unrelated at first glance. Families discovered that mistakes could be leveraged against them. Minor errors snowballed into crises, and every solution contained hidden dangers. Even careful planning could not anticipate every consequence, leaving victims to navigate a landscape where the rules were known only to the orchestrator of their suffering. The relentless nature of manipulation reinforced helplessness. Families began to internalize failure, believing that no action could change the trajectory of their lives. Children watched, learning the weight of fear, the consequences of misplaced trust, and the fragility of stability. Parents, exhausted by the constant calculation, became cautious in every aspect of life, measuring risk, re-evaluating choices, and preparing for disasters that were always just out of sight. Even the man himself maintained a public persona of respectability and success. He attended social events, engaged in charitable work, and presented himself as an advisor, philanthropist, and pillar of the community. The contrast between public admiration and private devastation intensified the psychological torment of his victims. Every smile in a photograph, every handshake at a public gathering, became a reminder that accountability was absent and that suffering remained invisible to the world. The destruction was quiet but absolute. Families that had survived the initial wave of manipulation now faced an even more insidious erosion of security. Small miscalculations, an overlooked clause, a delayed payment, or a misplaced document triggered consequences that seemed sudden but were meticulously engineered. One family, already on edge, discovered that a minor adjustment to a contract had allowed an intermediary to claim their property. The shock was devastating. Parents confronted helplessness. Children watched as their homes slipped from grasp. As the neighborhood whispered warnings too late to prevent further loss. Emotional strain became as consuming as financial ruin. Marriages that had survived the initial chaos began to fracture under the pressure. Arguments over decisions influenced by invisible hands escalated into long-lasting tension. Parents questioned their judgment, wondering how each choice had led them into disaster, despite their best efforts. Children absorbed the anxiety, developing caution and distrust before they could understand the mechanics behind the manipulation. Every interaction, every attempt at recovery, reinforced the idea that their lives were not fully their own. Neighborhood dynamics shifted dramatically. Streets once filled with casual greetings and shared trust now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Families warned newcomers about the risks of engagement. Neighbors hesitated to offer support, and communal activities became rare. The invisible threat extended beyond those directly affected, shaping behavior across blocks. Even those untouched directly by his schemes learned to measure risk in every transaction, interaction, and contract. The psychological footprint of manipulation was as expansive as the financial one, embedding itself into the culture of the city itself. For small businesses, the consequences were devastating and multi-layered. One shopkeeper attempting to negotiate a supplier agreement found himself trapped in obligations he had never consented to. Debts multiplied through technicalities, and customers lost due to indirect interference. Every perceived opportunity carried hidden peril, and every recovery effort was anticipated and countered. Even those with experience navigating business transactions were forced into defensive positions, unable to grow, expand, or regain independence. The cumulative effect was bankruptcy, social stigma, and an ongoing sense of vulnerability. Attempts to resist were meticulously neutralized. Legal petitions were delayed, bureaucratic obstacles amplified, and even minor victories were offset by new pressures. Families learned the limits of conventional resistance and adapted by minimizing exposure, isolating themselves and carefully calculating each step. The slow, deliberate nature of these manipulations ensured that resilience could be developed but never fully rewarded, leaving victims perpetually cautious, exhausted, and aware of their own fragility. Isolation became a defense mechanism. Families withdrew from social interaction to avoid entanglement, Neighbors hesitated to help, and community cohesion frayed. Each attempt at support risked triggering new obligations or exposing hidden consequences. The man's influence ensured that collaboration, often a source of relief, was too dangerous to attempt. Families learned the hard way that survival required not only careful planning, but also a degree of solitude, suspicion, and constant vigilance. Even those who survived financially intact were marked. Anxiety became a permanent companion, trust a fragile commodity, and hope cautiously measured. Every contract, loan, or promise was evaluated for hidden risk. Children internalized lessons of fear, learning to anticipate betrayal before it could arrive. Parents navigated everyday decisions, as though the threat of ruin lingered just beyond reach. The legacy of manipulation extended far beyond the immediate victims, shaping behavior, community norms, and social interaction in subtle but permanent ways. The man's public persona remained flawless. While families suffered in silence, he attended social events, donated to charities, and received praise from civic leaders. Every accolade he received deepened the humiliation of his victims. The contrast between public perception and private devastation intensified the psychological torment. Each smile, handshake, and photograph became a reminder of the absence of accountability and the invisibility of suffering. Families who attempted to rebuild faced relentless obstacles. Minor mistakes or overlooked details reignited old crises. Legal entanglements resurfaced, new debts appeared, and opportunities vanished. Even careful planning could not prevent further complications. The slow, patient orchestration of setbacks ensured that no family fully escaped his influence. Each day reinforced the lesson that stability was fragile, trust was dangerous, and hope required constant vigilance. By the time the cumulative effect became visible, entire neighborhoods had adapted to the presence of unseen manipulation. Families operated cautiously, businesses acted conservatively, and social interactions were measured. The ripple effect of his influence was profound. It had reshaped norms, instilled fear, and created a culture of suspicion that extended far beyond direct victims. Children who grew up in this environment internalized caution. Parents passed down lessons of distrust, and the shadow of manipulation lingered long after immediate crises passed. Years passed, yet the shadow of manipulation did not fade. Families who had once hoped to recover found themselves constantly reminded of past failures, each new decision tinged with the memory of loss. A widow, now juggling the care of her children and the remnants of her former home, discovered that a minor contract adjustment had transferred a portion of her property to an intermediary. The legal language was precise yet cruelly opaque. Every effort to reclaim control was met with delay, obstruction, and subtle intimidation. Each attempt to restore stability only reinforced the inescapable nature of her predicament. Children, too, bore the consequences in ways adults often overlooked. They learned early that trust could be dangerous, that opportunity often concealed peril, and that even seemingly benign gestures might harbor hidden consequences. Playgrounds, classrooms, and streets carried the weight of these lessons invisibly. A simple question about a neighbor's offer of help could provoke anxiety. A fleeting invitation to play might be questioned for its potential risk. The man's influence extended far beyond the immediate victims, embedding a culture of caution, suspicion, and fear that would persist for generations. Small businesses continued to suffer long after direct interference ended. One shopkeeper, whose debts had been subtly manipulated to the breaking point, struggled to regain clientele, rebuild reputation, and secure suppliers. Every attempt at recovery was shadowed by the memory of past entanglements. Creditors were hesitant, customers cautious, and neighbors wary of involvement. The lessons of failure became ingrained, teaching that opportunity could be engineered into disaster, and that even careful planning could not fully mitigate unseen risks. Families who sought to rebuild emotionally faced an equally challenging landscape. Marital strain, born of years of relentless pressure, often persisted. Parents carried a persistent anxiety into daily life, guiding decisions with fear as a compass rather than hope. Children internalized these lessons, growing into cautious, calculating adults whose capacity for trust was diminished. Communities absorbed the impact collectively, whispering warnings to new arrivals, advising restraint, and embedding cautionary tales into social norms. The psychological footprint was as expansive as the financial one. Attempts to regain lost property, recover debts, or restore livelihoods were met with precise obstruction. Legal avenues were extended, delayed, or complicated. Minor successes were countered by hidden clauses, bureaucratic snares, or intermediaries acting on his behalf. Families quickly learned that even partial victories carried hidden costs, often resulting in new obligations, renewed anxiety, or public humiliation. The relentless nature of these manipulations ensured that recovery was never complete, and that the memory of loss remained vivid. Even when distance offered some relief, the lessons endured. Families who relocated or attempted to rebuild in new neighborhoods found that caution had become instinct. Children, now older, approached interactions with suspicion. Parents measured every offer of help, scrutinized every contract, and prepared for contingencies that might never occur. The legacy of manipulation shaped behavior, expectations, and social interaction, extending the man's influence far beyond those directly targeted. Isolation became both a consequence and a survival tactic. Families learned to limit engagement with neighbors, friends, and institutions to minimize exposure to hidden risks. Even acts of kindness were weighed carefully, for any involvement could result in unforeseen complications. Communities became fragmented, social cohesion weakened, and collective trust eroded. The subtle omnipresence of manipulation reshaped the city's social fabric, leaving permanent marks on relationships, behavior, and expectations. Financial recovery remained elusive for many. Debts, even when partially repaid, resurfaced through technicalities or intermediaries. Property regained could be threatened by legal maneuvers. Small successes were offset by hidden obligations, each carefully timed to maximize stress and minimize opportunity for growth. Families learned that stability was conditional, precarious, and constantly threatened, and that even minor lapses could have catastrophic consequences. The psychological burden compounded over time. Parents, exhausted from navigating relentless challenges, became cautious to the point of hypervigilance. Children absorbed these lessons, developing a worldview defined by anticipation of danger, suspicion of authority, and wariness of trust. Emotional resilience, once possible, was undermined by repeated lessons in helplessness. The city's social landscape, once lively and connected, transformed under the subtle but persistent weight of fear. Even as the man aged, his reputation remained untarnished. He continued to attend social functions, receive accolades, and present himself as a benefactor. The contrast between public admiration and private devastation sharpened the cruelty. Victims' suffering remained invisible, their humiliation compounded by society's praise of the very individual responsible. Each photograph, each handshake, each public recognition served as a reminder that justice was absent, that accountability was impossible, and that the consequences of his actions would linger indefinitely. The erosion of family bonds became inevitable. Parents, exhausted by relentless stress and constant calculation, began to argue more frequently over choices they once made confidently. Every decision carried weight far beyond its immediate consequence. Each small mistake could trigger new financial obligations, legal complications, or social humiliation. Children witnessing the strain internalized anxiety as a permanent state. Siblings grew distant, unsure how to act in a household governed by invisible pressures. Emotional connections frayed as survival took precedence over affection. Neighborhoods, too, reflected the consequences. Streets once filled with casual conversations now hummed with quiet suspicion. Families whispered warnings about engaging with outsiders. Businesses hesitated to extend credit or trust, and community gatherings became scarce. Even those untouched directly by the manipulations altered their behavior in anticipation of potential danger. The social fabric of entire blocks had shifted, replaced by caution, wariness, and an unspoken agreement to avoid interference at all costs. Financial instability persisted. Even families who managed to retain their homes struggled to regain lost savings. Property values fluctuated due to the manipulations, and small business owners found it difficult to rebuild clientele or negotiate supplier agreements. Every recovery attempt was shadowed by memories of previous entanglements. Minor setbacks were magnified into crises, teaching that opportunity itself could be weaponized. The long-term effect was clear. Economic mobility was stunted, independence was fragile, and a single miscalculation could undo years of effort. The psychological consequences were even more pervasive. Adults lived in constant anticipation of new threats, each interaction measured for potential risk. Children grew into adolescence with a worldview shaped by fear, doubt, and careful calculation. Trust was conditional. Hope was fragile. Even ordinary social interactions, school invitations, neighborly advice, or community programs were weighed against the possibility of hidden costs. The man's influence had extended far beyond the individuals he directly targeted, reshaping the collective mindset of neighborhoods and communities. Attempts to rebuild social bonds often failed. Families who tried to seek support, whether through neighbors or local organizations, discovered that even well-meaning interventions could result in new complications. Legal challenges emerged unexpectedly, debts were claimed through intermediaries, and minor misunderstandings escalated into disputes. Isolation, once a choice, became a necessity. Families learned that engagement carried risk and that survival required careful management of every relationship. Even those who had survived without major financial losses were scarred. Anxiety became a permanent fixture, guiding behavior and decision-making. Parents navigated each day with heightened caution, scrutinizing contracts, communications, and opportunities for hidden traps. Children internalized these lessons, developing skills in vigilance and risk assessment that would outlast the immediate crisis. Emotional resilience was compromised, replaced by hyper-awareness and a cautious approach to life. The man's public persona remained untouched. While families suffered in silence, he continued to present himself as a respected figure, attending social events, contributing to charities, and receiving accolades. The stark contrast between public admiration and private devastation amplified the cruelty. Victims' struggles were invisible, their humiliation compounded by society's praise of the architect of their ruin. Each smile, handshake, and public acknowledgement became a reminder that accountability was absent and that suffering could persist indefinitely without redress. By this point, the pattern of destruction was fully embedded. Families who had been directly affected remained vigilant. Those indirectly touched adopted similar caution, and neighborhoods collectively adapted to an environment defined by subtle manipulation and control. Children grew up understanding that stability was never guaranteed, that opportunity could conceal danger, and that the world was not inherently fair. Even those with resources or connections discovered that influence could be wielded with precision, leaving them vulnerable despite apparent advantages. The ripple effect extended to economic and social structures. Businesses adapted to minimize exposure, often at the expense of growth or innovation. Community initiatives were approached cautiously or abandoned altogether. Social bonds weakened, leaving a culture of quiet fear and vigilance. The city itself, while outwardly thriving, bore the invisible weight of manipulation, a subtle testament to the long-term consequences of one man's deliberate cruelty. By the end of these years, the lessons were clear and unyielding. Families learned to live within tightly controlled margins, to anticipate potential pitfalls, and to measure every interaction. Children matured with a heightened sense of awareness, adults navigated life cautiously, and neighborhoods functioned under a collective understanding of risk. The impact was not only material but psychological, social, and cultural, a permanent legacy of calculated devastation. And yet, amidst all this suffering, the man remained untouchable. Public accolades, social recognition, and civic praise continued to shield him from scrutiny. His life, outwardly respectable and admired, stood in stark contrast to the lives he had dismantled. The disconnect between perception and reality sharpened the cruelty. Victims endured invisible suffering, while society celebrated the very individual responsible. The lesson was indelible. Power, cunning, and patience could allow one to manipulate entire communities with near impunity. Years of meticulous manipulation had finally begun to show cracks, though not in the way anyone would have expected. The man, who had orchestrated the collapse of countless families with precise timing, patience and an uncanny understanding of human weakness, had grown old. Age slowed his steps, and the once commanding presence that inspired fear and compliance had softened into a frail figure. Yet the city he had shaped through unseen hands remained, a living testament to the destruction he had sown. Families long battered by his schemes had learned to survive in spite of him. Some managed to reclaim small pieces of stability, though the scars of loss were permanent. Children who had once trembled under the shadow of his influence were now adults, cautious yet resilient, navigating life with lessons carved into their very instincts. They approached opportunities with suspicion, yes, but also with a careful determination that he had never anticipated. What he had believed to be permanent control was, in some ways, eroding, not through confrontation, but through the inexorable passage of time and the subtle assertion of human resilience. His public persona remained unblemished. Even in his final years, he was celebrated in civic circles, praised for generosity, intellect, and leadership. The irony was profound. The architect of hundreds of ruined lives was still lauded for the very qualities that had enabled his cruelty. Photographs captured smiles that masked decades of suffering, and neighbors still spoke of him in tones of admiration. Yet privately, even he could no longer maintain the intricate network of control that had once extended across blocks and families. The machinery of manipulation, once precise and deliberate, faltered under the inevitability of aging and diminished capacity. Victim stories unfolded quietly but powerfully. A widow who had lost her home decades prior finally secured a small property. Through careful planning and legal assistance, her children now grown and independent. Though the memory of fear lingered, there was a measure of satisfaction in reclaiming even a fraction of what had been taken. A former shopkeeper rebuilt a modest business, relying on lessons learned the hard way, each step guided by caution, but also by determination. The patterns of control he had enforced had left permanent impressions, yet human adaptability proved stronger than his precision. Neighborhoods, too, slowly healed. Streets that had once been marked by whispered warnings and quiet suspicion saw cautious reconnection. Families who had survived the manipulation began to support one another, sharing knowledge and guidance to prevent future exploitation. While the shadow of the man's influence never fully disappeared, communities demonstrated resilience. Trust, once fragile, began to be rebuilt, carefully, layer by layer, and new generations grew up aware but not paralyzed by fear. Psychologically, the legacy of his cruelty was enduring. Adults carried anxiety and hypervigilance, their instincts forever shaped by past experiences. Children matured with heightened awareness of risk, understanding that opportunities often hid unseen dangers. Emotional scars remained, but they coexisted with the hard-earned strength of those who had survived. The city bore the marks of his influence, yet it was also marked by the quiet triumphs of recovery and the subtle victories of ordinary people, reclaiming autonomy over their lives. The man himself faced the ultimate helplessness he had never anticipated. Legal protections, civic immunity, and social standing could no longer shield him from the slow decay of age. His memory faltered, and the meticulous records, strategies, and contingencies he once relied upon became meaningless. Families that had long been trapped in webs of manipulation began asserting independence. Cases were resolved, debts clarified, and small victories accumulated where once there had been only fear. The predator, once untouchable, could no longer manage the complexity he had created. Yet the contrast between past and present was stark. While he had once orchestrated precise ruin, the lives of his victims had begun to stabilize through patience, persistence, and careful planning. They had internalized lessons of caution, yet also demonstrated ingenuity and resilience. The slow unraveling of his influence was not dramatic, but absolute. The very power he had wielded through fear and calculation had diminished with time, leaving him powerless to alter outcomes or reclaim the dominance he had enjoyed for decades. Regret finally entered the picture, not in the form of public scrutiny, but private reflection. Alone in his home, he confronted the consequences of a lifetime spent manipulating others. Faces of those he had ruined surfaced in memory, each a reminder of suffering inflicted for personal gain. The magnitude of what he had done, once invisible, became undeniable in solitude. There were no apologies, no restitution, no acknowledgement beyond the silent weight of realization. For the first time, control eluded him, and the full scope of his actions settled heavily on his conscience. For many victims, closure arrived in small, understated ways. A mother who had once feared eviction watched her children graduate. Their cautious confidence, a testament to endurance. A small business owner, long constrained by legal entanglements, finally expanded with prudence and experience. Communities, once fractured by suspicion, held small gatherings, where shared knowledge and collective vigilance became a form of quiet triumph. The slow passage of time had allowed life to reclaim spaces that fear had once dominated, and yet the shadow of cruelty remained a lesson etched into history. The man's strategies, the precision of manipulation, and the relentless patience that had characterized decades of harm became stories whispered among families and neighborhoods. They were cautionary tales not for horror or fear, but for understanding the fragility of trust, the consequences of unchecked cunning, and the resilience required to survive calculated cruelty. The city had endured, and so had its people, forever shaped but not destroyed. In the end, the predator's life concluded not with triumph, but with the quiet inevitability of aging and helplessness. Victims, in their own ways, found stability, regained agency, and passed forward lessons of vigilance, prudence, and resilience. The cycle of manipulation had ended, and though scars remained, the long-term impact was a complex tapestry of regret, survival, and human endurance. Where cruelty had once ruled, human persistence proved stronger, leaving behind a city forever changed but not conquered.